Hello again everybody, and welcome back to another edition of On the Range, and today again I'm in the A-10C Warthog, but discussing a topic that can really apply to any aircraft from any era, as long as it's being employed in the air-to-ground role. And I'm specifically going to be discussing the technique that I like to use to roll in and engage a target on the ground. And this is in response to a comment where the commenter was asking, when I roll in on a target and then stabilize and roll out, what am I doing with my flight controls? What are my throttle settings? How is my trim set up? What am I doing with my rudders? And I'll do the best I can to discuss the technique that I use, keeping in mind that I'm just a flight simmer like everybody else. I fix them for a living. I don't fly them, so I'm always kind of treading on dangerous ground whenever I talk about actually flying the aircraft. But I'll do the best that I can and get right into the demonstration. Now, the vast majority of the attacks that I make in any aircraft when I'm doing air-to-ground is the same, or set up the same. I pick a target offset from the nose, either left or right, and then I roll in on the target, pull the nose around, roll out, place the reticule, whatever, however you want to pronounce it, on the target and release the weapon, trying to make it as smooth and as effective as possible. And the key there being to roll out so that whatever you're using to aim the weapon, be it the CCIP reticule or the gun reticule or whatever, is as close to the target or is in the right position on the ground after you roll out. That's really what makes this technique work, and it really is the hardest part of it, and it is the key. So to demonstrate one more time, just the basic technique is roll in on the target, roll out, and then tweak from there and engage the target with whatever weapon that you happen to be carrying. Now, and like I said, the hardest part is gauging how and where to roll out. But let me make 2 points before I get to the technique that I use to roll out and make sure that my aiming device, reticule or whatever, is in the right place. So the first point I'd like to make is airspeed and the importance in the A-10C especially of doing this with a high airspeed. So generally speaking, if I'm rolling in on an attack, I want to be as fast as I can possibly get the A-10 to go. Looking for 250 knots being the absolute bare minimum that I would want to roll in on a target at. And because the lower the airspeed, and I'll demonstrate this real quick by chopping the throttles and putting out the air brakes. The lower the airspeed, the less responsive the aircraft is to your control inputs, and the harder it is to make fine adjustments to get the target underneath the reticule or the CCIP pipper or whatever you happen to be using. So down to like 206 knots. Okay, now I roll into the target and coming around looking for it. It's just sluggish. I can't really make fine controls, and when I do go to roll out, you run into this little phenomenon in the A-10 where the aircraft is going to have a tendency to yaw in the opposite direction that you roll. So keeping the airspeed up, I roll in at I try to roll in at no less than 250 knots or as fast as I can get the aircraft to go. But the higher the airspeed, the easier it is to manage your flight path and the easier it is to roll out and successfully engage the target. And it's very, very hard to get the A-10 going too fast. The only time I would ever think about pulling the throttles back if I'm in the target area is if I'm diving at more than, say, like a 45-degree angle. At that point, would I pull the throttles back, and even then I wouldn't pull them back all the way because it's very, very hard to make the A-10 go too fast. That's hardly ever your primary consideration. So that's the importance of airspeed when it comes to making this successful. Now the second point, and this is another one of those secondary points, and we'll get to the big point up next, but the second point I'd like to make is the importance of proper trim when you're rolling on the target. So right now I'm level at 300 knots, about 4,900 feet above sea level, and I'm trimmed out for, I'm trimmed out straight and level, trimmed out for 1G. So now watch what happens and pay particular attention to my rocket reticule as I roll in on the target. And watch what the reticule does on the ground. Okay, so I roll in, stabilize on the ground, and now watch as I pick up airspeed that the reticule goes faster and faster and faster across the ground. And that's because as I pick up airspeed, my trim is going to go nose up. So the faster I go, the more the aircraft's nose is going to trim in the up direction, just by itself. So that's why, just as a, and there's all kinds of rules of thumb out there, and if you've been doing this a while, you probably have your own little technique that you do, but generally speaking, if I'm starting out from straight and level, I want to, if I'm going in, say in a shallow dive, say less than 10 degrees, give it, with my trim control, maybe 2 clicks of nose down, so that as I roll in, the nose is already trending down. So as I have the reticule on the ground, it's either stationary or just tracking gently up on the ground. It's not picking up too much speed, or the reticule itself is not moving too fast across the ground as I go. And if I'm in a steeper dive, say anything 10 to 30 degrees, maybe actually I think a rule of thumb that I've read somewhere is maybe 1 click for every 10 degrees that you're going down. So maybe 1 click for 10 degrees, 2 clicks for 20, 3 clicks for 30, 40 and 45 degrees, maybe 4 or 5 clicks of nose down trim. But the key there is just to make sure that as you get into the dive and pick up airspeed, that the nose is not coming up at too fast a rate, and that you're not fighting the trim of the aircraft as you're trying to align your sighting device and engage on the target itself. Now, one other short consideration before I get to the heart of the matter, and let me just briefly discuss what I'm doing with the controls as far as control inputs as I'm performing this technique. Now, I mentioned before that the aircraft has a tendency as you roll for it to yaw in the opposite direction. That's the adverse yaw that you get just due to the design of the aircraft. But the aircraft itself has a stability augmentation system built in, so it's going to damp out that yaw, and it's going to somewhat keep the aircraft in coordinated flight for you. So if I had to give a quick and dirty of what I do with control inputs, again keeping in mind that I'm just a flight simmer, what I do is when I roll, I keep it as smooth as possible. I'm nowhere near max deflection on the stick as I roll it over. Also, as I'm into the bank, just a gentle, just touching barely the right rudders to the right to keep it, just help it out, keeping coordinated. I really don't have to do that if I release the rudders. It's still very, very coordinated, but just a touch, just out of habit. And then the important part is when I get to the point where I'm ready to roll out, if I have any G's on the aircraft, and I usually have about anywhere from 2 to 3 G's on the aircraft, I unload the aircraft, meaning that I release the back pressure on the stick, let it get back to 1 G, and then roll out. By doing that, by keeping my airspeed up as I go, by using just gentle rudder inputs, I don't even have to touch the rudder at all in the A-10, it's just out of habit, and by unloading the aircraft and getting it back to 1 G flight before I think about rolling out, then I really don't have to worry about any of the adverse handling characteristics of the A-10. Everything is going to be damped out for me. Everything is going to be just perfect. So smooth controls is what it takes. Now, coming back around and getting really to the heart of the matter, and this is the main point of the video, and it's how to gauge when and where to roll out on the target. So let me, as a demonstration, bring the nose back around, and if you look on the ground as I roll the aircraft, look how everything moves. Things that are down here at the bottom of the HUD, as I roll, move in relation to the world, everything just kind of pivots around this point right up here at the top of the HUD. So what I want to do is use that knowledge to my advantage, because I know that, like for example, right now I'm about to employ the gun on some tanks out here to the right. I know that I want ultimately to roll out with those tanks just in front of the gun reticule, with the reticule just after the tanks. But I also know that when I roll, that the point that the reticule is pointing is going to move as I roll out. So that means that I want to use the top of the HUD as a reference. Place the top of the HUD out in front of the target, and then when I roll out, the target is going to swing back to the point where the reticule is on the HUD. And let me do this real quick to demonstrate what I mean. So I come around to the target area, and I'll gain some altitude so that I can do this from a dive. So coming around, I have plenty of airspeed, I'm offset from the target, and I have visual on them out there in the distance. And I'm just going to come around to a and just do this from a gentle dive. I plug in just a little bit of nose down trim. Okay, rolling in on the target area, and I see them out there in the distance, and I want to place the top of the HUD out in the distance in front of them, and then use that as a gauge on where to roll out. And I did it a little bit too early, but bottom line there is I had that point where everything rotates around as you're looking at it in front of the target, so that when I rolled out, now my reticule is down here just after the target, and I'm in a good position to start making little tweaks and fire on them. Okay, so about 7, 8, 7,000, 6,000, 5, 4, 2 second burst,
altitude,
and off the target. So that's what I mean by using the top of the HUD as a gauge, and using that pivot point where everything in the world pivots as you roll as your gauge of where to roll out. So let me climb up to high altitude, and I'll demonstrate that on a bombs run to close out the video, so I'll be right back. Okay, so coming around for another run from high altitude. I'm going to do this in CCIP with Mark 82s. I'm just going to release one bomb, but I've got enough airspeed for this altitude. I've got some nose down trim plugged in, and I'm just coming around making sure that I have visual on the target, and I'm going to roll in using the top of the HUD to gauge, as a gauge, to put the top of the HUD in front of the target, so that I know as I roll out that the target is going to be down here in the bottom of the HUD, and I can just walk my reticule up from there. Okay, good visual. Okay, looks about 40 degrees on the dive. Good enough, rolling in. Okay, placing the HUD in front of the target location, rolling out. And now I just walk that CCIP reticule up to the target. Release. And off the target. Okay, so that's a very, very basic. I don't feel like I covered that in enough detail, but you're going to see a whole lot more on this topic of how, different techniques to do CCIP bombing, manual bombing, and the initial aim-off point, initial pit replacement that I kind of glazed on right there will be a huge part of it. But hopefully that did explain a little bit about the technique that I like to use on air-to-ground employment in the A-10 and other aircraft for that matter. So I hope you did enjoy it, and if you did enjoy it, please do consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and leaving a comment. It really does help. And I will see you next time.